when you're setting up your rods, whether it be tip-ups or regular rods or jigging rods, you got to be thinking really, what type of line do you want to use? Are you going to use fluorocarbon? Are you going to use monofilament? You're going to use braided line? Are you going to use a leader or no leader? But not only what type of line, you got to ask what weight. You use too heavy of a line, and there's going to be some finicky fish that it's going to deter, and they're not going to strike. On the flip side, if you use too light of line, you might hook into that trophy fish, the one you've been chasing, and it breaks your line before you're able to land it. It's important when it comes to fishing that you're connected using the right line. Peter would have known this. He was a fisherman. And we first see him in Luke chapter 5. He's there washing his nets after a long night of fishing. And Jesus comes along and hops in his boat. I'd love it if Jesus just doesn't say anything and just sort of hops in there and makes himself at home. We don't know if they knew each other from being in the area or not, but he hops in there and he has them put out from shore a little bit so he can teach the people. And this just helps them be able to speak more clearly and them to hear it because the sound travels over the water. But afterwards, when he's finished, he looks to Peter and he says, "Go put out to deep water and let down your nets." And if I'm Peter, I'm probably thinking, what does this guy know, right? He's the son of the carpenter. I'm the fisherman. I know what works and what doesn't. He's like, listen, we have already been out all night with no luck. But for some reason, we don't know why, he gives in and he goes out and he lets down his net. And it says this in Luke chapter 5, verse 6, and when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish and their nets began breaking. Right? There's so much fish that the nets were breaking. They didn't have the right line for the amount of fish that they were caught, probably because they didn't expect to catch that many fish. They had to call for help, which included James and John, and it's at this moment that they realize who Jesus is. And so when they get back to shore, what amazes me is they just leave everything, even all this large haul of fish they've gotten that would have been, I'm sure, a very significant amount of money, and follow Jesus. And they follow him during his ministry on this earth, becoming his disciple, learn what it means, what Jesus is doing, what he's a part of, what his plan is. And they stick with him until Jesus is betrayed and crucified and buried and rose again. We're going to pick up in John 21. And they have already experienced Jesus after having been raised from the dead. But we find Peter, James, and John back out on the water again, fishing. And this is where we see Jesus appear to them, and he calls them from the shore. They don't know it's Jesus at this time, but he says, "Cast your net on the other side of the boat." And they do so, and then they catch so many fish that they can't pull it up. The boats begin to sink, and so they have to call from help. Well, Peter realizes it's Jesus, and he hops in the water and leaves everybody else to bring the boats to shore. But we read this about the haul of fish in John 21:11. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. It's an interesting detail. But it's significant because it specifically says in Luke earlier on that the net was torn. So you got to ask the question, really, what changed? What's the difference in this? And the answer is obviously Jesus. Right? That through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, what was broken before has now been unbroken. It's been fixed. What was impossible before is now possible through his power. The question is, as you go through life, and life throws all this stuff at you, stuff that is so heavy, that if you're not using the right type of line, it's going to break you. But when your trust and your hope and your faith is in Jesus Christ and his power, we find that all that stuff that used to break us is now we're able to handle it. Right? Because his power, that same power that raised Jesus from the dead, now lives in us. And we can withstand anything, any weight that the world throws at us through Jesus Christ.